The night my husband left for his 3-year contract abroad. I kissed him goodbye under the harsh white lights of Charlotte Douglas Airport, smiled like the supportive wife everyone believed I was, and waited until his plane disappeared into the Carolina sky before I made the most calculated decision of my life. He squeezed my hand at the gate and said, "3 years will go by fast." I nodded. Even let my eyes gloss over the way a loving wife's should. Anyone watching would have thought I was devastated to see him go. What no one saw was what I had seen 6 weeks earlier on our shared iPad. A message that wasn't meant for me. A housing confirmation in Dubai Marina that didn't include my name anywhere on the document. A quiet clause about spousal status undisclosed. That smile at the airport wasn't devotion. It was strategy. By the time his flight leveled somewhere over the Atlantic, I already knew our marriage wasn't stretching across 3 years. It was hanging by a thread he thought only he was holding. The house felt different when I walked back in that night. Too still. Too orderly. The kitchen lights reflected off the marble island we'd picked out together 2 summers ago, when his company bonus had come through and he insisted we upgrade our lifestyle. I set my purse down exactly where I always did. I took off my heels. I even poured myself a glass of water like it was any ordinary Tuesday. My phone buzzed. Boarding was smooth. "Love you. Thank you for believing in me." I stared at the message longer than necessary. "Thank you for believing in me." I typed back. "Of course. So proud of you." Then I placed the phone face down on the counter. 9 years of marriage. No children. By mutual decision. Shared investments. Shared tax returns. Shared reputation in his tight-knit family, who always praised his ambition and quietly tolerated my independence. On paper, we looked stable, successful, untouchable. I sat at the dining table and opened my laptop. The number stared back at me. $480,000 in our joint account. It wasn't just his money. A large portion had come from the sale of my late father's rental property, another portion from my consulting contracts over the past 5 years, the rest from his bonuses and dividends from the small family business his brother managed. His family had always spoken about that account like it was an extension of his success, as if my contribution was decorative. 6 weeks earlier, I had been searching for a recipe on our shared iPad when the email preview slid across the top of the screen. From Nadia Al-Fayed. Subject: Family relocation package confirmed. I remember how ordinary the kitchen looked in that moment. The sunlight on the floor. The hum of the refrigerator. I opened the email before I could stop myself. Attached was a lease agreement for an executive apartment in Dubai Marina. 2 bedrooms. Corporate housing allowance approved. A line near the bottom referenced dual occupancy confirmed. My name was nowhere in the document. At first, I told myself there had to be a business explanation. Maybe it was standard wording. Maybe the company used generic forms. But then I searched the thread. The negotiation emails dated back 4 months. 4 months before he told me about the promotion. 4 months of planning. One line in particular still echoed in my mind. "She won't make this difficult. She trusts me." I closed the laptop that afternoon and waited until he came home. Smiling. Talking about expansion and international growth. I didn't confront him. I watched. I listened. I started asking quiet questions he didn't realize were strategic. 3 days later, I hired a private investigator. The report had arrived the week before his flight. I hadn't opened it until tonight. My fingers hovered over the PDF now. I clicked. Lease confirmed. Utilities activated 2 months prior. Multiple corporate dinners categorized as client hospitality. All attended with the same woman whose name had appeared in that first email. And then the part that made my pulse slow instead of spike. A draft separation agreement saved in his cloud account. Dated 3 weeks before he officially accepted the overseas contract. He had planned legal distance before physical distance. I leaned back in my chair and looked again at the balance on the screen. $480,000. I wasn't angry in that moment. I was clear. My attorney's words from earlier that afternoon resurfaced in my mind. If he relocates and shifts funds offshore, you may lose leverage. Once money leaves the country, it becomes harder to trace. Leverage. I clicked into the transfer screen. Not to execute it yet, but to understand the mechanics. That's when I noticed something else. A saved international wire template. Destination: a bank in the Cayman Islands. The beneficiary listed under a holding corporation I didn't recognize. The template hadn't been used. Not yet. His plane status updated on my phone. Departed. I whispered into the quiet kitchen. You already left before tonight. Then I opened a secure message thread with my attorney and typed 5 words. I'm ready to move forward. I didn't sleep the night after I moved the money. The house felt like it was holding its breath. Like the walls themselves knew something irreversible had happened. At 6 a.m, pale light slipped through the kitchen windows, catching the edge of my laptop still open on the counter. The confirmation email from the bank sat in my inbox. Transfer successful. Funds secured. My phone buzzed a few minutes later. Landed. Long flight. Everything okay back home? I stared at his name on the screen. Just 12 hours earlier. He had kissed my forehead and promised we'd FaceTime every night. Now he was on another continent. And our joint account balance no longer looked the way he remembered. All good. I typed. Get some rest. I placed the phone down carefully, as if sudden movement might fracture something fragile. 6 weeks earlier, the fracture had already begun. I can still see the kitchen that afternoon. I had flour on my hands from rolling out dough. The iPad was propped up against the backsplash while I searched for a lemon tart recipe. When the notification slid across the top of the screen, I almost ignored it. From Nadia Al-Fayed. Subject: relocation housing finalized. Something about the word finalized made my fingers freeze. I tapped it. The email was crisp. Professional. It referenced executive housing in Dubai Marina. Lease start date confirmed. Corporate relocation package approved. Then I saw it. A line that read, spousal discretion clause acknowledged. I scrolled faster. There was mention of dual occupancy. There were floor plans attached. There were move-in details. There was no mention of me. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the company handled paperwork this way. Maybe it was a draft. But when I searched the thread, I saw months of back-and-forth negotiation, adjustments to housing allowances, requests for specific neighborhoods, discussions about privacy. One email from him stood out. She won't make this complicated. She trusts me. I felt something cold settle under my ribs. That night, I didn't confront him. I watched him talk about the opportunity over dinner. He described Dubai like a stepping stone to something bigger, a promotion that would secure our future. He used the word "our" easily. 3 days later, I contacted a private investigator in Charlotte. I didn't tell anyone. I paid from a small inheritance account my father had left solely in my name. If I was wrong, no one would ever know. If I was right, I needed proof. When the investigator called me the first time, his voice carried a tone I hadn't expected. There's more here than an affair, he said carefully. The report arrived the following week. Back in my kitchen now, with the escrow confirmation sitting in my inbox, I opened the investigator's file fully for the first time. Lease agreement signed 2 months ago. Utilities activated under his name and a secondary authorized occupant. Corporate card charges flagged as client hospitality, recurring at the same waterfront restaurant. Photographs attached. Grainy but clear enough. Him entering the building twice, always with the same woman. I stared at her face longer than I meant to. But the financial section was what made my pulse slow instead of race. Several transfers from his recent performance bonus had been routed through a consulting LLC registered under his brother's name. The payments were categorized as advisory services tied to international expansion. The dates aligned with the relocation negotiations. This wasn't impulsive betrayal. It was structured. My mind drifted back to Thanksgiving last year. His brother had joked about global scaling between bites of turkey. His mother had smiled at me across the table and said, "A good wife knows when to step back and let a man grow." At the time, I thought it was harmless. Now it felt rehearsed. I scrolled further down the report. There it was. Draft separation agreement. Saved to his cloud account 3 weeks before he ever mentioned Dubai to me. The language was clinical. It assumed primary residency abroad. It outlined asset division under the expectation that marital funds would be restructured for international tax efficiency. He had planned legal distance before physical distance. My phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't him. It was a message request from Nadia. "I think we need to talk," she wrote. "He didn't tell you everything." I felt something shift inside me. Not jealousy. Not rage. Leverage. I closed the investigator's report and leaned back in my chair. The escrow transfer had already gone through. The $480,000 was no longer sitting in a place he could quietly drain once he felt secure overseas. He thought he was several steps ahead. What he didn't know was that I had been reading the blueprint for weeks. I typed back to Nadia with steady hands. What exactly didn't he tell me? 3 days after he landed in Dubai, he posted a photo of himself standing in front of a glass tower. The skyline behind him glowing gold in the late afternoon sun. New beginnings. The caption read, "Grateful for the opportunity." Hundreds of likes. "Congratulations from colleagues." A comment from his brother. "Proud of you." Meant. And then I saw it. Nadia had liked the post. Not as a heart. Not as a stranger. As someone already inside the circle. He called that evening, FaceTiming from what he described as temporary corporate housing. I recognized the marble backsplash behind him instantly. I had seen it in the investigator's photos. "You settling in, okay?" I asked, keeping my tone warm. "Yeah," he said, smiling. "It's been nonstop. But it's good. This is going to be huge for us." For us? I watched his eyes carefully. They didn't flicker. He had rehearsed this. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet living room and asked myself the question anyone would ask. Why didn't I confront him before he left? The answer was simple. Because confrontation would have warned him. If I had thrown the iPad on the table and demanded answers, he would have deleted files, shifted funds faster, called his brother, called an attorney overseas. He would have painted me as emotional, unstable, paranoid. Instead, I scheduled an appointment with my lawyer. Her office in Charlotte was understated, lined with dark shelves and framed degrees. She listened without interrupting while I laid out the timeline. The housing email, the investigator's findings, the draft separation agreement. When I finished, she folded her hands on the desk. "If he files for separation first from overseas," she said, "jurisdiction becomes complicated. You want control of venue. Timing matters. Timing." She explained North Carolina's equitable distribution laws. Marital assets. Documentation. Risk of income being restructured through foreign subsidiaries. If he reroutes bonuses through offshore entities, she added, tracing becomes harder. Harder. I nodded. I wasn't interested in harder. That night, I opened the investigator's report again and focused on the draft separation agreement. The metadata showed it had been edited on the same night as our 9th anniversary dinner. I remembered that dinner vividly. Candlelight. A quiet restaurant uptown. He had raised his glass and said, "To another decade. To growth." He had reached across the table and squeezed my hand. 3 hours later, he had been editing a document outlining how to divide our life. The realization didn't break me. It clarified me. A few days later, I reviewed the financial transfers again. The bonus routed through his brother's consulting LLC stood out more clearly now. Advisory services. International strategy support. I searched public business records. The LLC had been formed just 5 months earlier. 5 months. Before he ever mentioned Dubai. Thanksgiving flashed in my mind again. His brother joking about expansion. His mother telling me how proud she was that he was thinking globally. At the time, I thought it was harmless family enthusiasm. Now it looked coordinated. My phone buzzed mid-afternoon. It was him. "Have you checked the accounts lately?" he asked casually once I answered. The question was too smooth. "Why would I?" I replied lightly. A pause. Just making sure everything's running normally. Normally, after we hung up, I stared at the ceiling for a long moment. He was testing the waters. That evening, I finally responded to Nadia. What exactly didn't he tell me? Her reply came within minutes. He told HR you had already agreed to stay behind and manage finances separately. My chest tightened. I never signed anything. I typed. I know. She wrote back. That's the problem. We scheduled a call for the next morning. I slept lightly that night. Not from fear, but from anticipation. Something bigger was forming beneath the surface. Something that extended beyond an affair. The next day, as I waited for the Zoom call to connect, my phone lit up again. A notification from our bank. Login attempt detected. Location. Dubai. He was checking. He still didn't know the balance had changed. The screen flickered as Nadia's face appeared. Professional. Composed. Not the villain I had imagined. I'm not calling as his partner, she said immediately. I'm calling as someone who needs to protect my position. Protect. The word echoed in my mind. For the first time since this began, I understood something clearly. I wasn't the only one he had underestimated. And if he thought I was going to confront him with tears and accusations, he still didn't understand who he had married. The night I moved the money, the house was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator echoing off the tile. His plane had already taken off. The flight tracker on my phone showed a small icon moving steadily over the Atlantic. I stood at the kitchen island for a long moment, staring at the laptop screen as if it might blink first. $480,000. Not just his salary. Not just his bonus. My father's property sale. My consulting contracts. Years of careful saving. Years of believing in our future. I logged into the account again. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see it clearly before it changed. That was when I noticed something I had missed earlier. Under saved transfers, there was an international wire template already prepared. Destination bank. Cayman Islands. Beneficiary. A holding corporation with a sterile, forgettable name. The amount field was blank, but everything else was filled in. He hadn't executed it yet. Not yet. My pulse didn't spike. It slowed. I picked up my phone and called my attorney one last time before doing anything irreversible. It's there, I said quietly when she answered. An offshore template. Already set up. She didn't sound surprised. Then you move first, she replied. Escrow protects the funds. You're preserving marital assets, not stealing them. Once money leaves the country, recovery becomes significantly more complicated. Preserving. The word felt solid. When I hung up, I opened the escrow account details she had sent earlier that day. Everything was prepared. All that remained was confirmation. I entered the amount manually. 4, 8, 0, 0, 0, 0. The numbers looked almost unreal lined up in the transfer box. A memory flashed through my mind without permission. Our wedding day. His hand at the small of my back. The promise that we were a team. I pushed the image away. The bank sent a multi-factor authentication code to my phone. 6 digits. I typed them in slowly. Deliberately. My finger hovered over the final confirmation button. He was somewhere above the ocean at that exact moment. Confident in his timing. Confident in his distance. I pressed confirm. The screen refreshed. Transfer scheduled. Funds will clear within 24 hours. That was it. No dramatic sound. No alarm. Just stillness. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. Fraud prevention from the bank. Ma'am? We're calling to verify a large transfer request from your joint account. Yes, I answered calmly. That was me. Security questions followed. My mother's maiden name. The street I grew up on. Details he would have known just as easily as I did. When the call ended, the transfer remained intact. 2 hours later, a notification appeared. Login attempt detected. Location. Charlotte Douglas Airport Wi-Fi. He must have checked the balance before boarding and assumed everything was normal. He had no idea that in the time it took to cross the Atlantic, the foundation had shifted. My laptop chimed again. An email. From Nadia. Subject line. You deserve clarity. I hesitated only a second before opening it. I need to be transparent, she wrote. This situation is not what you think. She explained that she was the regional chief financial officer overseeing relocation packages for executive transfers. Their relationship, she claimed, had started after contract negotiations were underway. She believed he was already separating. He told her finances were divided, that I had agreed to remain in the United States. My jaw tightened. She attached internal documents, housing allowance approvals, executive relocation benefits, a section labeled spousal transition compensation. There it was in black and white. Additional monthly funds allocated to support a spouse during relocation. He had categorized me as remaining dependent by choice. The allowance had already begun dispersing, not into our joint account, into an executive expense channel he controlled. This wasn't just betrayal. It was structured manipulation. If audited, those documents would require proof of disclosure, proof of consent. I had signed nothing. My phone rang again. His name lit up the screen. I answered on the second ring. Did you move the money? He asked without greeting. His voice was tight, restrained. I secured our assets. I replied evenly. You had no right to drain the account. I didn't drain it. I preserved it. A long silence followed. That offshore template was standard tax planning, he said finally. You don't understand how international contracts work. I glanced at the open housing document on my screen. I understand more than you think, I said quietly. He exhaled sharply. You're overreacting. Maybe he believed that. Maybe he needed to. After the call ended, another message appeared from Nadia. There's an internal audit scheduled next quarter, she wrote. Compliance is already reviewing relocation documentation. I closed my laptop slowly. Moving the $480,000 had felt bold. But as I stood alone in the quiet kitchen, one truth settled deeper than anything else. The money wasn't the only thing that had shifted that night. For the first time since he started planning his exit, I wasn't the one reacting. He was. 3 weeks after I moved the money, I sat in my home office with the blinds half drawn and waited for Nadia's face to appear on my screen. When the Zoom connected, she didn't look like a villain. She looked tired. I'm not calling as his partner, she said immediately. I'm calling as the chief financial officer responsible for relocation compliance. Her tone was measured, professional, almost rehearsed. There was no apology in it. Just calculation. I need to understand exactly what he told you, I replied. She nodded once. He told us you were aware of the overseas assignment months ago, that you agreed to remain in the United States temporarily and manage finances independently. I never signed anything, I said. I'm aware of that now. She shared her screen. A corporate document appeared. Executive relocation package, approved. His name at the top. Salary adjustment. Housing allowance. Performance incentives. And then a section titled Spousal Transition Compensation. Additional monthly funds had been allocated to support me during relocation. He had checked a box that read Spouse Remaining by Choice. Consent acknowledged. My name was typed beneath it. My signature was not. He signed a declaration stating you were informed and consenting, Nadia said quietly. If compliance reviews this, they'll request proof, and there is none. I answered. She inhaled slowly. That's why I'm concerned. Concern, not guilt. What happens if the audit finds discrepancies? I asked. She didn't hesitate. Suspension pending investigation. Potential termination for misrepresentation. Visa complications. Visa complications. His entire 3-year contract depended on employment sponsorship. She clicked to another document. Expense reimbursements. Housing allowances disbursed through an executive expense channel. Advisory service invoices tied to an external consulting firm. The name of the firm made my stomach tighten. His brother's LLC. These invoices were approved under expansion strategy, she said. They were presented as legitimate advisory fees. They weren't disclosed as related party transactions, I replied. Her eyes lifted to meet mine through the screen. No, she said. They weren't. For a moment, neither of us spoke. This wasn't just an affair. This was a financial structure built on omissions. My phone buzzed on the desk. His name flashed across the screen. I silenced it. Nadia noticed. He's been asking questions, she said. Corporate compliance requested clarification about housing documentation. So the audit has started? I replied. It's early, she corrected. But yes, a review is underway. Why tell me? I asked. She leaned back slightly. Because if this escalates, I will be asked what I knew and when. I need documentation aligned with reality. Reality. He had told her I was already emotionally and financially separate. He had told corporate I was informed. He had told his family I was supportive. He had told me we were building a future together. He had rewritten the narrative depending on the audience. I'm filing for divorce, I said evenly. She didn't look surprised. Then you should request every relocation document bearing his signature, she said. Especially the marital disclosures. Will you send them? A pause. If I do, she said carefully, you'll have everything. My phone vibrated again. This time, a text message. Why are corporate asking about housing? I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on Nadia. Send them, I said. I'll decide what to do with them. Within minutes, encrypted files began appearing in my inbox. Housing approvals, compensation breakdowns, compliance acknowledgments, his electronic signature on each page. One document included a certification stating that all marital disclosures were accurate to the best of his knowledge. My chest tightened, not with pain, but with clarity. He had assumed I would remain quiet, that I would sign separation papers once he felt secure abroad, that I would accept a reduced portion of our joint account because distance made confrontation inconvenient. Instead, the very structure he used to position himself was now unstable. Compliance meets next month, Nadia said before ending the call. If discrepancies are confirmed, it won't stay internal. When the screen went dark, the room felt very small. My phone rang again. I answered this time. What did you say to corporate? He demanded. I haven't said anything. I replied truthfully. Then why are they reviewing my file? I let the silence stretch just long enough. Maybe because paperwork matters. His breathing shifted. You're trying to ruin this for me? No, I said calmly. I'm protecting myself. He exhaled sharply. You don't understand what's at stake. I looked at the documents on my screen. I understood perfectly. After we hung up, an automated notification appeared in my inbox. Employee compliance review initiated. I stared at the words for a long moment. The 3-year contract he thought would secure his independence was beginning to tremble under the weight of its own misrepresentations. And for the first time since he boarded that plane, promising everything would go by fast, I realized something steady and undeniable. Distance had never been his advantage. Documentation was mine. 2 months after he left, his mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon with a sweetness in her voice that felt rehearsed. How are you holding up, dear? She asked. It must be so hard managing everything alone. I'm managing, I replied evenly. There was a pause. Then she shifted. He mentioned something about the joint account being adjusted. Adjusted. I could almost see her sitting at her kitchen table, hands folded, fishing for confirmation. The funds are secure, I said. That's all that matters. Her tone cooled slightly. Secure from whom? Before I could answer, another voice came onto the line. His brother. You had no right to drain marital funds, he said bluntly. That money belongs to both of you. It still does, I replied. It's preserved in escrow. You're sabotaging his promotion, he snapped. Do you have any idea what's at stake? I did. His career. His visa, his carefully structured exit. "What's at stake?" I said calmly. "Is marital property being moved offshore without my consent?" Silence followed. They hadn't expected that. Thanksgiving arrived a week later, and I debated not going. But absence would have given them another narrative to control. So I showed up at his parents' house with a bottle of wine and a steady heartbeat. The table was set the way it always was. His mother's china, his father carving turkey at the head of the table, his brother seated confidently at her right. I took my usual seat. Conversation stayed shallow at first. Weather. Travel. The new contract overseas. Then his brother leaned back in his chair and said loudly, "Some people don't understand how international expansion works." His eyes were on me. A supportive wife would. His mother added softly. I placed my fork down gently. A supportive husband doesn't draft separation agreements before anniversary dinners. I replied. The table went still. His brother's jaw tightened. "You're overreacting." "Am I?" I asked. "After dessert." He cornered me near the hallway. "If you don't reverse that transfer," he said under his breath, "we'll pursue legal action for misappropriation." I held his gaze. "Go ahead," I said. "You'll have to explain the Cayman wire template in court." His expression shifted instantly. He hadn't known I knew. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered. "I know enough," I replied. The following Monday, I sat in my attorney's office and signed the divorce filing. If he planned to initiate proceedings from overseas, I would establish jurisdiction here first. North Carolina. Our marital residence. Our assets. Filing first limits his maneuvering room. My attorney said, especially if there's documented intent to relocate funds internationally. I nodded. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was initiating. Later that week, Nadia sent a brief update. Compliance had expanded their review. HR requested clarification on spousal consent documentation. Internal auditors were examining housing allowances and related party transactions. The tremor was spreading. That evening, his mother called again. There was no sweetness left. "You're ruining his career," she said sharply. "He signed those documents." I replied, "Not me. You could stop this." "No," I said quietly. "I could stop protecting him." She hung up without another word. 2 days later, the divorce papers were officially served to him in Dubai through international courier. I received confirmation of receipt. My phone rang almost immediately after. "What is this?" he demanded. "You filed." "Yes." "You couldn't even wait to discuss it." "You drafted a separation agreement months ago," I said. "You were already discussing it." "That was contingency planning." "So is this?" There was a long pause. "Corporate has questions," he finally admitted. "They're reviewing my housing declarations. I imagine they are." "Did you send them anything?" "I preserved my assets and filed for divorce." "That's all." His breathing changed. Not anger. Something closer to uncertainty. "What do you want?" he asked. There it was. Negotiation. "I want transparency," I replied, "and an equitable division." "You're blowing this up." "No," I said softly. "I'm responding to what you already built." The next morning, an official email from corporate compliance arrived in his inbox. I knew because he forwarded it to me without comment. Formal review scheduled. Administrative leave pending clarification. The 3-year contract that was supposed to secure his independence was beginning to fracture. I stood in my kitchen that evening, the same place I had pressed confirm on the transfer weeks earlier, and realized something unmistakable. The clock he thought was working in his favor had shifted, and for the first time since he boarded that plane, promising everything would go by fast. Time was no longer protecting him. 4 months after he left, Nadia sent a single sentence that changed the temperature of everything. "It's worse than expected." I read it twice before responding. Corporate compliance had completed the preliminary audit. The review uncovered misrepresentation of marital disclosure forms, improper routing of housing allowances, and undisclosed related party payments to his brother's consulting firm. The structure he had built so carefully was unraveling line by line. 2 days later, he called me in the middle of the night. "They've placed me on administrative leave," he said without greeting. His voice was thinner than I had ever heard it. "This is temporary." "Is it?" I asked quietly. "They're reviewing documentation. It's procedural." "And the housing declaration?" I pressed. Silence. "You're the only one who could have triggered this," he said finally. "I didn't forge your signature," I replied. He exhaled sharply. "You're destroying everything?" I looked around my living room, at the house that still held our framed wedding photos, at the life he had planned to exit quietly. "I didn't build this," I said. "You did." A week later, another message arrived from Nadia. Visa sponsorship under review. Without active employment. His residency status in Dubai was unstable. Corporate housing access was temporarily restricted pending investigation. The 3-year contract had lasted less than 5 months. He booked a return flight to Charlotte without telling his family. "My attorney informed me first." "He's coming back," she said. "Probably to stabilize jurisdiction before the next hearing." I didn't go to the airport. The symmetry of it wasn't lost on me. He had left confident and certain, promising distance and growth. Now he was returning under scrutiny. Contract suspended. Future uncertain. Our preliminary court hearing was scheduled the following week. The courtroom was colder than I expected. He stood across from me in a navy suit that suddenly looked ill-fitting, thinner, tired. My attorney presented documentation calmly. The escrow preservation. The offshore wire template saved under his profile. The draft separation agreement dated before he informed me of relocation. The judge reviewed the records carefully. "You moved funds to prevent potential offshore transfer?" She asked me directly. "Yes, Your Honor." "And documentation supports that risk?" "Yes." She nodded once. "Temporary joint financial freeze ordered pending full asset review." "Legally?" I wasn't reckless. I was prudent. After the hearing, he asked to speak privately. We stepped into an empty conference room down the hall. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I didn't think you would fight," he said finally. The honesty in that sentence cut deeper than any accusation. "You assumed I would sign whatever you placed in front of me," I replied. "I assumed you trusted me." "I did." He looked away first. "I can fix the corporate situation," he said. "If you don't escalate this." I didn't escalate it, I answered. "Your paperwork did." He ran a hand through his hair. "If you cooperate, we can settle this quietly. You keep a fair portion. I just need stability right now." Fair portion. As if the word fairness hadn't shifted entirely. "I'm not interfering with corporate," I said. "They're responding to internal inconsistencies." He studied my face, searching for something. Anger. Regret. Weakness. "I underestimated you," he admitted. "Yes?" I said. That night, an email arrived from corporate compliance. Employment contract under termination review. Not suspended. Not paused. Under review for termination. The consequences were no longer hypothetical. Without employment, the visa would collapse. Without the visa, the international relocation he had orchestrated would evaporate. The distance he believed would give him control had compressed into a narrow corridor with no exits. I stood in my kitchen again, the same place where this had shifted months earlier, and let the silence settle. He had told me 3 years would go by fast. In less than 5 months, the future he had built without me was already folding in on itself. And for the first time since I saw that relocation email on the iPad, I felt something close to stillness. Not revenge. Balance. 1 year after I stood in that airport pretending to believe him, I signed the final divorce settlement in a quiet courtroom in Charlotte. There was no drama left by then. No raised voices. Just paperwork, signatures, and the steady scratch of pens on thick legal documents. The escrow account that once held $480,000 had been examined, traced, and divided according to documented contribution, because I had preserved it before it vanished offshore. The court recognized the intent behind the transfer. The judge called it protective action under reasonable concern. Protective, not vindictive, not impulsive. Protective. I retained the majority share based on clear financial records. My father's property proceeds. My consulting income. Verified deposits over 9 years of marriage. The narrative that I had drained marital funds collapsed under documentation. He didn't argue much by the end. Corporate had already made its decision months earlier. Termination for misrepresentation of marital disclosure and improper handling of relocation allowances. Without employment. His visa sponsorship in Dubai dissolved. The corporate apartment was vacated. The 3-year contract that was supposed to redefine his future ended before the first year was complete. He moved into a short-term rental across town. No skyline photos. No new beginnings caption. Just quiet. His family stopped calling. At first, there were attempts to salvage pride. Suggestions that I had taken things too far. That I could have handled it privately. That loyalty should have outweighed legal strategy. But when the documents surfaced in court, draft separation agreements dated before his promotion announcement, the offshore wire template, the housing allowance certification signed without my consent, there was no room left for spin. Even his brother stopped making eye contact during mediation. The narrative shifted. Not publicly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. The truth has a way of doing that. I refinanced the house in my name 6 months after the divorce finalized. I replaced the dining table where I had opened that first investigator's report. I removed the wedding photos from the hallway without ceremony. I didn't burn them. I archived them. Because the story wasn't about hatred. It was about awareness. I expanded my consulting work into a full-time practice. I invested part of my settlement into a small local firm that specialized in financial compliance audits, an irony that didn't escape me. I built something stable, something transparent. For the first time in years, I knew exactly where every dollar was. Occasionally, I would think back to that night at the airport. The fluorescent lights, his confident smile, the way he said, 3 years will go by fast. He believed distance would protect him. That geography would give him leverage. That I would remain in place, grateful and compliant, while he reorganized our life behind the scenes. What he didn't account for was this. I was paying attention. I didn't empty our joint account because I was angry. I did it because I saw the pattern forming before he thought I would. I did it because financial betrayal isn't just about money, it's about erasure. About being written out of your own future while you're still standing in the room. The moment I realized that, something shifted inside me. Not into revenge. Into clarity. There is a difference between reacting emotionally and responding strategically. I chose response. He once told me I didn't understand how international contracts worked. What I understood was this. Any contract built on a mission eventually collapses. Time doesn't fix deception. Documentation exposes it. A year later, the house feels peaceful again. Not because the pain never existed, but because the uncertainty is gone. There is no offshore template waiting in the background. No hidden relocation clause. No draft separation agreement saved under a cloud account. There is just stability and self-trust. If you're listening to this and something inside you feels unsettled, if you've ever been told you're overreacting, if you've ever sensed a shift in your marriage or your finances and brushed it aside to keep peace, pause. Look at the paperwork. Ask the quiet questions. You don't need to scream to protect yourself. You need clarity. I share this not because I enjoy watching things fall apart, but because I know how easy it is to dismiss your own intuition, especially when everyone around you insists everything is fine. It wasn't revenge that changed my life. It was refusing to be excluded from it. If this story resonated with you, if you've experienced betrayal in a marriage, a family business, or a financial partnership, share your thoughts below. Your experience might be the confirmation someone else needs to stop doubting themselves. And if you believe in protecting your dignity, your finances, and your voice, stay here with me. Subscribe and remain part of this community where we talk honestly about family drama, hidden truths, and what happens when the tables finally turn. The night he boarded that plane, he thought he was signing a new contract overseas. What he didn't know was that I was signing one too. A contract with myself. And this time, I read every line before I agreed.